Good evening or good afternoon, and welcome to this special program, the Hazon Ish Letters to Zvi Yehuda. My name is Gil Yehuda, and I will be moderating this event, and I'm representing my family, my mother, Chasia, Zvi Yehuda's widow, my sister, Tali Yehuda Rosenbaum, my brother, Gil Yehuda, our spouses, and also the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Zvi Yehuda. And first, we'd like to very much thank the National Library of Israel for sponsoring this event, and special thanks to Yael Levy for organizing it. And for the next hour, we're going to be talking about the relationship between two extraordinary men, the Hazon Ish and Zvi Yehuda, and we'll also touch upon the historical significance of that relationship. We're going to hear from three fantastic speakers, Professor Marc Shapiro, Professor Benjamin Brown, and Gil Yehuda, whom I will introduce. And as you listen to the speakers, please feel free to use the chat and the QA button to enter your questions or comments, because we are going to have time for discussion at the end. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Rabbi Dr. Marc Shapiro is a professor at the University of Scranton, where he holds the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Chair in Judaic Studies. Professor Shapiro is the author of many books on various topics in Orthodox Judaism, including the intersectionality of modern Orthodox and Haredi Judaism. Professor Shapiro also contributes to the Sfarim blog and recently wrote a comprehensive post that included an analysis of some of the letters from the Hazon Ish that are being donated and their historic significance. And his talk is entitled Letters from the Heart, the Hazon Ish Correspondence with Zvi Yehuda. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Professor Shapiro.
Yes, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. So for the next 20 minutes, that's what I will speak about. 40 years ago, most Jewishly knowledgeable people in America, even if they knew the name Zvi Yehuda, did not know that he had any connection to Hazon Ish. This changed in 1979 with the appearance of two articles in Tradition, the journal published by the Rabbinical Council of America. In the summer 1979 article, Yehuda published an article, quote, "The Hazon Ish on the Future of the State of Israel." In the following issue, another article, Hazon Ish on Textual Criticism and Halacha, appeared. In fact, these articles were part of a letter. Before the articles, it states, quote, "The following article is excerpted from a letter sent to his daughter Rachel by Professor Yehuda," the person who just introduced me. And the story as I heard it, and you can correct me, Professor Yehuda, if this is incorrect, is that it was Rav Aaron Rakefet who was teaching at Machon Gold or Michalai, I forget which one at the time. And when you showed him this letter, he thought it was important to be part of the public record, so he sent it into Tradition. After the appearance of these articles, I think many people were probably wondering, how is it that a close student of the Hazon Ish was teaching at the Cleveland College of Jewish Studies? Anyone who knows anything about the Hazon Ish knows that that's not a typical career path for a student of the Hazon Ish. Obviously, the Hazon Ish supported Torah study to the exclusion of secular studies in the yeshiva world model, and that is the path, he believed, for proper Jewish intellectuals. Now, Yehuda was, of course, the second close student of the Hazon Ish to leave the path of the yeshiva world, as it were. The other is famously Chaim Grada. The difference, of course, is while Chaim Grada becomes a secular writer, Yehuda remains in the religious world, just more, I guess we call it the religious Zionist, the modern Orthodox world. Yehuda is a close student of the Hazon Ish from 1941, when he was 15, approximately 1941, until the early 1950s. During some of these years, he learned with the Hazon Ish every day from 2 to 3 hours a day, and the Hazon Ish was like a father figure to him. I want to show you a picture that you can find online. Here it is. Here's the picture. Where my cursor is, that's a picture of Yehuda. There, of course, is the Hazon Ish. Between them is Rabbi Dessler, the famous Rabbi Dessler, at this time at Ponevezh. Here is Rabbi Shmuel Rozovsky, also an important rabbinic figure. So you get a sense just from this picture, which many people have seen it. They don't know who that man is, how close he was with the Hazon Ish that he would accompany him on that visit. Yehuda's relationship with the Hazon Ish is the reason we have some of the most important letters the Hazon Ish wrote. I'm referring to letters that are always cited in Haredi literature. And two of these letters, which I will soon discuss, are the most famous of all the Hazon Ish's letters. There is, in the collection, there is one letter that's completely halachic. I did a search on Otzar Chachma, and it only appears in one place, not in any of the Hazon Ish's writings. It appears in another book, which I assume has been circulated in the Haredi world. But to really understand the Hazon Ish's letter, you need to see Yehuda's one-page letter, halachic letter, which he writes to the Hazon Ish, and the Hazon Ish is replying. That letter has never appeared in print. I hope to publish it. The letters of the Hazon Ish in the published volume of his letters. Here's the volume 1 and 2, and then there's a third letter. They don't say who the recipient of the letters are. These are all letters of the Hazon Ish. You don't know who it goes to, not to mention that they take out other identifying information and other materials. So the Jewish world needs to be grateful to Yehuda, to the family of Yehuda, that they gratefully provided, that we are grateful, that they generously provided copies of these letters so that we all can see them. But furthermore, we need to be grateful to Zvi Yehuda, because he provided these letters in the 1950s to the people who were putting out the letters of the Hazon Ish. And that's why we had them for all these years. And now we can return them, as it were, to their rightful recipient, Rabbi Dr. Zvi Yehuda. Now, the letters of the Hazon Ish are important as they present us with the response of the Gadol Hador, in the Haredi terms, the great sage of the generation, to the questions of a curious young man who was starting to wonder, was this the proper path that he was on? The earliest of the letters, you can look in the letters of the Hazon Ish, is volume 1, number 41. According to Yehuda, this letter is from 1944. And here we get a glimpse of the strong connection of the Hazon Ish and Yehuda. The Hazon Ish ends his letters, Hadorei Shlamcha, Hadavuk Ba'avatcha. He's tied to him with love. The content of the letter is also interesting. The Hazon Ish writes, quote, I am very interested to know how you are doing. It's a mystery to me that you did not come to see me before leaving the city. What happened that you didn't feel like you could tell me about what was going on and you hurried to leave? I can't believe that you will abandon the Torah since your soul was deeply connected to it. Don't keep anything from me, but tell me everything. Apparently, the Hazon Ish had heard that Zvi Yehuda was interested in leaving the yeshiva world. That is, just not interested in studying Torah all day, but moving into some other area. And he wanted Yehuda to tell him what's going on. Yehuda replied to the Hazon Ish, and this led to the next letter to Yehuda, in which the Hazon Ish offers him guidance, designed to keep him on what today we would call the Haredi path. He says that he hopes that one day he will see that life below the sun has no value, and it's life above the sun that has value. This is a poetic way of contrasting a life of what we will call gashmius, materiality, with ruchnius, spirituality. And in these letters, we see a poetic side to the Hazon Ish, very different from the writings of a typical Talmudic scholar. As our distinguished panelist, Benny Brown, has shown, the Hazon Ish had read Haskalah literature, and he knew how to write in a very lyric fashion that comes out in these letters. There's another letter, later than the ones we've seen, where the Hazon Ish deals with Yehuda's choice to leave the yeshiva world. He had already made that choice. He says to Yehuda, I do not find this decision a correct one. But since I know I cannot force you to change your will, I'm not going to press this matter. However, he's hopeful that Yehuda on his own will change his mind, quote, and you will recognize that sitting in the yeshiva is the most suitable for you. Of the letters to Yehuda, the most important ones are Kovitz Igros Hazon Ish, volume 1, numbers 14 and 15. And these two are the most famous letters the Hazon Ish wrote, by which I mean they are the most quoted. Just think of this for a minute. It's the letters to Zvi Yehuda that are the most important letters ever written by the Hazon Ish, in my opinion. We'll see Professor Brown if he agrees. Let me look at them briefly and see why people have found them so important. And when I say the most famous, all you have to do is put in some words in Otzar Chachma, and you see them quoted again and again. We don't know if these letters are responses to letters that Zvi Yehuda wrote to Hazon Ish, or perhaps he visited him, and this led the Hazon Ish, and he said something, and this led the Hazon Ish to write. 114 begins with the Hazon Ish stressing the fundamentals of the faith. That is, there's divine providence, immortality of the soul, reward and punishment, prophecy. He contrasts this with non-believers who have no faith. After setting this out, the Hazon Ish writes that he established his entire life with complete certainty on the 13 principles of faith and Maimonides. And this has given him an endless love of Torah. Now, this passage has often been quoted as an illustration of the Hazon Ish as the man of faith, as opposed to what we often think of him as the man of Ish Halacha. And I am certain that this is the second most quoted passage in the Hazon Ish's letters. He also mentions that he is full of love for his fellow man, in particular for a talented young man. This is, of course, referring to Yehuda. Then comes words which are, I believe, unlike anything else we have in the Hazon Ish's letters in terms of their emotion. The Hazon Ish is not speaking in generalities. He's speaking directly to Yehuda, telling him how attached he is to him. I just want to read you in the original in Hebrew for those who understand just some of these words, and then I'll summarize what it says. Ashir ani gam ahavat zulati, uviyichud letza'ir mezuyan bechishronot v'lev mevin. צעיר השוקד על התורה מלבב אותי וצודד את נפשי, וזיכרונו ממלא את כל עולמי, ונפשי קשורה בו בעבותות אהבה בל יינתקו. He's speaking about how attached he is, and how here is a young man, Yehuda, full of talent in Torah. And of course, it bothers him that he's leaving the yeshiva world. He continues that when he saw that Yehuda was deciding to choose the Chaim Shel Hashuk, that is going out, getting a job, the things, material life, over the Chaim Shel Torah, namely remaining in the yeshiva world, he didn't know what to do. He says that he had great pain, but he restrained himself, which presumably means he didn't press the matter. He didn't speak to Yehuda about this. But now he is speaking to him, and he says that I pray that you will return to the Torah world. But the Hazon Ish says he has feelings of hopelessness. On the one hand, he wonders if it would be best just to forget about his connection to Yehuda, so he wouldn't feel this pain, this terrible pain, which he's feeling for a second time after what happened with Chaim Grada. He says that this is the path of Ahavat Adam et Atzmo. If you only are focused on yourself, you want to prevent pain, so you no longer, he'll cut his contacts with Zvi Yehuda, so not suffer any more pain. On the other hand, he states, my love for you did not give me peace. It's like a child. You can't cut yourself off from a child, maybe a student, but not someone who basically served as a surrogate child. He said, because the Hazon Ish had no children, for those who are unaware. He says to Yehuda that since you left me some time ago and have no desire for me, which means that he didn't want to come see him, I guess, or discuss these matters. So you see how hurtful this was to the Hazon Ish. This caused me to move in the direction of forgetting, but how difficult it is now that you have awakened the old love. Apparently, Zvi Yehuda wrote him a letter, or came to visit him. And now the Hazon Ish is feeling his old feelings of attachment. It's incredible how the Hazon Ish will share these deep and conflicting emotions. Now, the letter immediately following this one, number 15, is also of great significance. Here he tells Yehuda that when it comes to matters of faith, the proper path is simple belief. Far from mechkar. Mechkar means philosophical investigation. One should believe the principles of faith in their simple form as they are understood by both a chacham, a wise man, and a hedyot, a simple person. The Hazon Ish amazingly writes that his desire is to be a simple person, Yisrael hedyot, who accepts belief in Torah Sheba'al Peh without asking why. And he explains what he's referring to. And that is, he says that no one after the Mishnah can dispute with it, and no one after the codes of the Talmud can dispute with the Talmud. Why does he say this? Did Yehuda offer some modern scholarly interpretation of the Mishnah that is at odds with the Talmudic interpretation? Or maybe Yehuda raised the question, why are we bound to the Talmudic decisions? Why can't the Gaonim differ with the Talmud? And then the Hazon Ish makes a far-reaching statement that is, I believe, the most quoted of anything in his letters. I think it's actually the second most quoted passage in all of the Hazon Ish's writings after his famous words in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, that all the harsh and terrible things said about heretics, not least that they should be killed, are not applicable in contemporary times. They're only said in previous generations, in an era where we could properly rebuke sinners and in which God's providence was manifest, but neither of these apply in contemporary times. This is the famous justification for outreach, regarding the irreligious, as what we call tinok shenishbo. He says to Yehuda that the basis of faith is that everything mentioned in the Talmud, including in the Agadah, are matters that were revealed through the sages' prophetic power. Anyone who doubts anything from the sages in either halacha or agadah is considered a heretic. The Hazon Ish continues that he's not going to elaborate on this, for he sees that Yehuda wants to be a good Jew and not join with the heretics. And therefore, he should not involve himself in these questions. Obviously, Yehuda was concerned with academic-style questions, even when he was still in Israel. He then comes to America and he gets a PhD. And of course, this category of heretics would include, lots of people that we normally think of as being regularly part of the Orthodox fold. He adds, the Hazon Ish adds that the breakdown of tradition began in this very way, with people adopting, quote, liberal approaches in such matters. And there's a lot of truth to this. We do know that, many of the early Maskilim, first they undermined the authority of the great rabbis and even the Talmud sages in non-halachic matters, only later coming to question their halachic rulings. Now, these words of the Hazon Ish are quoted again and again in Haredi literature, and they present an extreme position when it comes to Emunat Chachamim, trust in the sages, especially in the Talmud. It's been pointed out also many times that the position of the Hazon Ish is at odds not just with Maimonides, the Rambam, but with the entire Gaonic tradition and many other great commentators. Could the Hazon Ish really have believed in such an extreme approach, knowing that many great sages disagreed, that if you question an Agadah, you're regarded as a heretic? This is a rejection completely of the whole Maimonidean, Gaonic, Spanish tradition, as well as many figures in later years. Could Hazon Ish really have believed this? Or are his words to be understood in a polemical vein, perhaps as a way maybe of scaring Zvi Yehuda to bring him back to the yeshiva world? Again, anyone who wants further details about these sorts of matters, I can only recommend a very large book by my co-panelist here, Professor Benjamin Brown. I'm sure if you write to him, he'll tell you which pages to go to for his discussion, if you don't have the koach to make it through the whole thing. I would love to know, and maybe the family can provide some insight if they spoke about this, what Yehuda said or wrote that led the Hazon Ish to write this strong letter, which, as I mentioned, is the most quoted of all the Hazon Ish's letters. Let me conclude by simply noting that the letters really give us a window into the soul of the Hazon Ish, which without these letters, our understanding him will be lacking it will be a lacuna in certain important areas. However, let us also not forget to whom the letters were written. For me, at least, it is hard to read these letters, knowing who they were to, without pondering how Yehuda responded to these letters, by which I mean what his internal thought process was after reading what the Hazon Ish wrote to him. It is certainly very unusual to be given Musar from the Gadol Hador, and yet Yehuda was able to summon the courage to chart his own path, despite knowing how opposed his Rebbe was. It's fascinating. If you look in the Haredi biographies and literature, when they cite these letters, they have all sorts of theories who this person is. Some say he's a family member of the Hazon Ish who went off the path. And of course, when they say went off the path, it could be someone who's completely irreligious. And there's all these discussions there, but now we know who it is. And we know he didn't go, quote, off the path. He adopted a different approach, which maybe from the Hazon Ish's perspective is off the path. But it really, it allows us to understand the story so much better and understand who the Hazon Ish was replying to, why he said what he said. And with that, I think I'll end.
Thank you so much, Professor Shapiro. That was so fascinating, and it put a lot of things in context for me, a lot of things that I didn't realize until just now. Indeed, their relationship was very close, and the Hazon Ish, as I think you know, did not have children of his own, so that might be part of it. I'm going to introduce our second speaker now, Dr. Benjamin Brown, who is professor of Jewish thought at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And Professor Brown wrote his PhD, in fact, on the Hazon Ish, and is the author of the scholarly work that Professor Shapiro mentioned, very, very big book entitled Hazon Ish, Halachist, Believer, and Leader in the Haredi Revolution. And that was published in 2011. Professor Brown's talk today is entitled The Hazon Ish and Its Youth. Keep the comments and questions going in the chat. We will have time for a rich discussion later. Professor Brown, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you and good evening. I'm really pleased and honored to talk in this evening, this event. And as Professor Yehuda just told you, I was in some touch with the late Professor Yehuda, Zvi Yehuda, with regard to my PhD, and I met him twice actually to interview him for the PhD, which was a really illuminating piece of information. Both of the meetings were very helpful to me, and then later we kept being in touch both by email and by meetings when he came to visit in Israel. And now it's really a kind of closing the circle. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad also to hear that he donated that the family donated these letters to the National Library, which is indeed the best place for them in any possible aspect. So the Hazon Ish was, as Professor Yehuda just told us, was not a father of any children. He was a barren person and actually he married a woman that was much older than him, and probably because of that she couldn't have children. That the couple couldn't have children. And when the Hazon Ish discovered that, according at least to one hearsay, he wanted to divorce his wife, but she kind of threatened to commit suicide, and then he neglected, he actually gave away this idea of divorce and kept his marriage with her until the end of his life. Instead, he, as a kind of compensation, he used to adopt, so to speak, young people and learn with them, foster them, be very fatherly towards them. One of them, the most famous among them, as Professor Shapiro has just mentioned, is Chaim Grade. There were more, even in Lithuania, in his period pre-war life in Poland. And also later, when he came to Israel, he found this, at least in the first stage of his stay here, he found young people in whom he was interested. Later on, he put most of his efforts on his nephews. One of them, Chaim Kanievsky, is today is Gdol Ador, but also Chaim Greiniman and others. He fostered them like his own, as if they were his own children. But one of them is also Zvi Yehuda, who wasn't any family member, and it wasn't related to him by family relations. Still, he was very fatherly toward him and fostered him as a future Talmid Chochem. Professor Zvi Yehuda, in that interview that we had together when we first met, he told me, and let me quote here. I'm just giving a free translation, but those of you who can read Hebrew can see that in the text that I share with you now, text number 1. Zvi Yehuda told me that actually it was his father that first came to the Hazon Ish to consult him regarding something, and he took Zvi Yehuda with him. He was about 15, and when he got his father got the answer, the Hazon Ish started talking to him about words of Torah, yes, Talmudic issues, and when they finished the meeting, Hazon Ish offered Zvi Yehuda that they learn together. Zvi Yehuda was happy, but didn't really take it seriously. And then later, as he said that humorously, the Hazon Ish courted me, he said, and sent another letter. Why didn't you come? And since then, he used to come to learn with him almost every day. In different periods, the frequency changed, and the ties became closer and closer. Zvi Yehuda says he loved me very much and probably expected much of me. And retrospectively, I can say that I was a great disappointed for the Hazon Ish. When I went to the army, it broke his heart. And later on in the interview, he says also that when he looked at the Hazon Ish's nephews, already then fostered by him, Zvi Yehuda told me, I asked myself, did he really believe that I'll become someone like them, one of them? That was impossible in his perspective, and he really didn't, in spite of the I would say the temptation that he didn't really ever had. He overcame and it never became a part of the Haredi world. Later on, when he emigrated to the United States, he went to the academic course and developed there. Now, I also prepared the same text that Professor Marc Shapiro just read to us, where it says, I'm rich in my love toward other people, and especially toward young people equipped with great talents and an understanding heart. A young person who is diligent, learning Torah, makes me happy and catches my heart, my soul, and his memory fills my entire world, and my soul is tied with his, with bondages of love, which are undetachable. These are very, very warm words, very, very loving words. He wrote that to Zvi Yehuda in that letter number 14 in volume 1. By the way, I'm really happy that Professor Shapiro really analyzed it so beautifully. I think that the emphasis in the other letter that Professor Shapiro read on that there is no difference between Halacha and Agada. It's all we're all committed to the words of the sages in the same level. I'm not sure. I didn't speak about it with Professor Yehuda, the late Professor Yehuda, but I believe that it's first and foremost a kind of polemic against the Torah and Derech Eretz approach. Actually, the distinction between Halacha and Agada is very sharply presented in the introduction to Chorev by Rabbi Hirsch. I believe that in that time, Professor Yehuda already developed kind of Torah and Derech Eretz attitude, which was a kind of divergence from the typical Haredi, Eastern European Haredi, Litvish Haredi approach. And he might have, just my speculation, present that idea to the Hazon Ish. Maybe there is difference. And look, you can see that there are great rabbis who did make a distinction. And to that, the Hazon Ish responded what he did. I've no evidence whatsoever to this speculation, but I think it makes sense, at least because of the emphasis of not differentiating between Halacha and Agada. However, the Hazon Ish, as I said, had many kind of children he fostered, children, young people, youth, teenagers that he fostered. And but above all, the Hazon Ish was a halachist, a posek. And the question is whether the fact that he had such a warm, even sensitivity to young people was reflected to some degree in his rulings. Now, saying yes about this question is really dangerous. I mean, I would hesitate to do that, at least when speak, academically, and you have to be much more close. I mean, attached to the text. It's dangerous to say that, and psycho-halacha is a kind of discipline that is always rejected as speculative, and maybe rightly so. But sometimes, I mean, you without really deciding things too decisively, I think the halachic person's background, tendencies, weaknesses, I would say even, should be taken in consideration when analyzing him on the whole, in large scale. And when we know that the Hazon Ish was a person that didn't have children of his own, I think it must be taken in account when we, and that he loved young people of other parents. I think it has to be taken in account when we read these texts as well, halachic texts as well. Now, there are a few texts in which the Hazon Ish relates to the status of children mainly in terms of pikuach nefesh, in questions of pikuach nefesh. One of the earlier texts are are comments that he wrote to a contrast, to a booklet by Rabbi Gil Michel Schlesinger. It was published under the name Michel Moshe Schlesinger for some reason, probably a mistake. How should I treat my child in Shabbat and holidays? That was first published in Jerusalem in 1947, then later on had other editions, later editions. In that text, the Hazon Ish writes that actually you should take anything having to do with a baby's needs as pikuach nefesh, as something of life emergency, and he says it's forbidden to be stringent on that. Asur lachmir. whether it relates to his feeding, sleep, washing, anything else, because children, as I said, or babies, as I said, are spoiled, and every change can, even a slight change, can cause them some sorrow, some pain, and that may raise their temperature, and then actually change their whole physical condition, and make them sick, even up to danger, life danger. This, he says, is typical of babies of our time, who are more spoiled. At the end of the text, he said you can't tell anything about this in terms of age or anything else. The heart knows, he says, and also the strength of the person's feeling or sensitivity to his child's health, and on the other hand, is his fear or strictness of keeping Shabbat. And sometimes he says the law changes according to the person's faith in God and his his bitachon, his confidence in God. And in that, first of all, Hazon Ish actually suggests that children, Halev Yodea, we know that Halev Yodea Marat Nafsho, the Gemara says that because of Lev Yodea Marat Nafsho, you often listen to the patient more than you listen to the doctor. If the patient says, I'm in danger, and the doctor says he's not, you listen to the patient. But here it's not, the Alev Yodea, it's not just about how sick the person is, how sick the person's child as well. He can feel about that as well. Alev Yodea also not only Marat Nafsho, but even Marat Nefesh Ebno, his son's physical condition. But you can say that this is only limited to babies. He says no age limits about that, but still he speaks about babies. The point is that in another text, Hazon Ish speaks about the Chilul Shabbat, the desecrating the Shabbat for Katan, a minor, not necessarily a baby, but just a child until the age of 13. Here too, actually, there is already a ruling in the Shulchan Aruch saying that the Katan, the needs of a Katan, of a minor, are taken as chole she'ein bo sakana, like a sick person who is not in life danger. Hazon Ish actually takes it very relatively. He says that today, once again, today children are more sensitive, and says in our time, even a temporary hunger should be taken as a life danger, as a fatal danger, and you should take everything, he says, actually, as hakol bichlal safek, have bichlal safek sakana. Everything related to children, mainly to babies, but not only, should be taken as safek sakana. So it takes actually the Shulchan Aruch's ruling one step forward. The Shulchan Aruch said everything is like chole she'ein bo sakana, a patient that is not in danger. The Hazon Ish says everything related to children is like chole sheyesh bo safek sakana, at least safek sakana, which is actually like a person in danger. And once again, he says it goes according to the confidence in God. It might change. If you're very confident in God, you can have a great confidence in God, you can be a little stricter about that. But this is, you can say, this relates to things more having to do with pikuach nefesh. It's an age-old tendency of poskim to be strict about pikuach nefesh, meaning being lenient about Shabbat when there is some fear of pikuach nefesh. Hazon Ish was not that lenient on pikuach nefesh, on desecrating Shabbat for pikuach nefesh, but still, it's a part of the halachic discourse. But there are also evidence, texts and evidences about things not related to pikuach nefesh, in which the Hazon Ish shows great sensitivity to things having to do with children. For example, the halachic ruling since the 18th century, since Zvi Yehuda, is that opening an umbrella on Shabbat is forbidden because it's like tikkun mana. Hazon Ish says, actually, the Zvi Yehuda says that it's it's like building a tent. So it's like tikkun ma'ana, it's like fixing a tool or a cloth. And also afsha milta, it makes some noise. Uvda dechol, it's something having to do with mundane, everyday, weekday activity, וגורם פרצה. And then he also explains, or at least makes some hints that there can be more lenient approach, but still, after the Noida Yehuda has decided that, it's a kind of law that has been established, and one shouldn't make compromises about that because it may shake the halachic system. However, when it comes to deal with babies' carriages, which have canopies on them, the folding of canopies up and down is actually the same halachic problem or problematic issue as in opening an umbrella. It's actually the same kind of mechanism. And here the Hazon Ish becomes much more lenient. He says when the person stretches it, he makes a kind of roof, which is actually like making a tent. Even though that is the case, since it is fixed into the carriage, it's not something that you dismantle and then put again. It's a part. It's considered as if it were a part of the carriage, and therefore it is possible to open and close that canopy. Once again, doesn't mention that this law has to do anything with the fact that babies are in danger. Of course, opening the canopy and closing it has nothing to do with danger. But you can't really dismiss the possibility that the fact that here he deals not with an umbrella of adult people, but rather with carriages of children, is a part of the one of the factors, at least, that made his decision more lenient. Similar approach can be seen when he relates to spraying against insects. Basically, he says it's forbidden to spray against insects on Shabbat. But for a sick person or a baby, once again, it is allowed if the window or the door is open. But I would say that even these are all rulings related to Shabbat. But even this is not as much striking, I would say, like a very short testimony given in Orchot Ish by one of his nephews. He says, עובדה הווי בקטן שעמד מאחורי מרן ז"ל בתפילת 18 ולא פסע מרן ז"ל עד שסיים הנ"ל תפילתו. This is something probably very small, but it is a testimony that was probably captured the attention of the people around the Hazon Ish. The Hazon Ish prayed 18. He is Gdol Hador, is the famous rabbi, and the young boy was standing behind him, and the Hazon Ish finished his prayer before the young boy. Now, according to the plain halacha, if it was an adult, certainly the Hazon Ish should not make 3 steps back when someone is still praying behind him in order to let him finish his prayer without anything that distracts him. But here it's a minor. He's not even really fully obliged. He's just obliged to pray mishum chinuch. But still, the Hazon Ish has some basic respect to the young, and he doesn't make even though people are waiting for him, and he's Gdol Hador, and it's just a little boy. To kind of respect to the little boy's prayer at it. It doesn't do the 3 steps back. He waits until the young boy finishes, and only then he steps back as well. So I think all these sources, together with the testimonies about the Hazon Ish's attitude toward people like Chaim Grade, like Zvi Yehuda, and like his nephews, all teach us that the Hazon Ish actually had some basic sensitivity to young people. He didn't have children of his own. So he actually channeled his affectionate attitude and warmth to other children whom he fostered, and he was sensitive. We would say in the modern language, he was sensitive to children's rights. But it's not in a rights talk. It's not something having to do with rights, but being more sensitive to children, at least in the last text, children as people who are really a part of the halachic world, part of the Jewish world, people that should consider to some degree respectfully, just as you do to other people, and medically at least, as even more sensitive to than other people, adult people. So this is, I think, something about the Hazon Ish and the young.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That was really very interesting. And I did not know the story about the Hazon Ish's wife, that is why he stayed with her. And it really was a big sacrifice for him not to have children. And that's probably all very connected. Thank you for that very interesting insight. So there are a lot of questions in the chat. We'll get to them later. Some of them are asking to fill out more of the biography of Zvi Yehuda. And I think that that will be very well covered in the next talk by our third speaker, who is Gil Yehuda. Gil Yehuda is an open source technology and executive at US Bank, but he is not going to speak about any of that today. He's here to provide some personal reflections of his own and on behalf of our family as Rabbi Yehuda's son. So I cede the floor to you, Gil.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you all for being here. It's so good to see all of you. Okay, so we heard about the letters. We heard a little bit about the Hazon Ish. I want to tell you a little bit about the recipient of the letters and a perspective. I was young when I came to learn that our family had a safety deposit box in the bank. And I had seen enough movies to know that people keep their most precious possessions in such a box. And I didn't think that we were wealthy, but maybe the stash was in that box. So I asked my father about it, and he said that the box contained the most precious physical possession he owned. And I imagined stacks of money or jewels or coins, but he continued, and he said letters from his teacher. My father treated these letters the way people treat their most valuable possessions. They were a connection to somebody who had a profound influence in his life. And that's when I learned that sentiment and meaning are immeasurably more valuable than anything else we have. So for as long as I can remember, there was this framed picture of the Hazon Ish in our dining room. It was prominently situated on our china cabinet next to a carefully saran-wrapped sterling silver tea set that I never saw anyone use. We didn't have a similarly prominent picture of my grandfather, and I'm sure that at some point I assumed the man in the picture was my grandfather, but I eventually realized and learned that it was actually my father's teacher. Now, it never struck me odd until I was preparing for this talk that I don't have any pictures of my teachers in my living room. Maybe you do, and if so, it must be for a very special teacher. As both professors said, it was actually my grandfather who introduced our father to the Hazon Ish when he was a teenager. And my father was indeed not a typical B'nai Brak Haredi yeshiva boy. His father was a follower of Rav Kook, also not a Haredi. Yet the Hazon Ish realized that my father was exceptionally clever and had the instincts of a Talmudic scholar, and he invited him to learn with him daily and even asked him to stick around after learning to listen in on important meetings. And as suggested earlier, I think the Hazon Ish saw my father as more than just a student, but as a protege. And given that he didn't have his own children, maybe like a son figure as he had seen with some of his other students. Now, I learned about the Hazon Ish when I attended a Haredi yeshiva as a teenager. And there, I learned he was an ultra-Orthodox icon, a political figure who held extremely stringent opinions about halakha. Today's youth would say he was an influencer with a lot of followers, but we use the term Gadol Hador to convey his greatness. And it was significant to me that a man like the Hazon Ish was my father's teacher and mentor. But to be honest, it was hard for me to picture my father in the orbit of the Hazon Ish. My father, Rabbi Dr. Zvi Yehuda, was a modern man. True, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of Jewish sources, but he also studied secular philosophy, law, science, history, and even art. My father was an impressive person, but my yeshiva experiences taught me that Haredi people tend to admire other Haredi people. Yet the Hazon Ish more than admired my father. As the letters indicated, he held him with deep respect and adoration. So when I was in yeshiva, I found the book, the Igrot Hazon Ish, in the bookstore, and I brought it home as a gift to my father. And when I showed him the book, my father reacted emotionally. He explained to me that the book was published after the Hazon Ish died, and he showed me which of the letters in the book had actually been sent to him, and that he still had the originals in that safety deposit box. And he pointed to me how affectionate the letters were. And then he noted that they were edited and the names of the recipients were removed. He had shared the copies with the person who was collecting the letters, saying it would be a tribute to the Hazon Ish, but he didn't expect the letters to be edited. My father then told me that he once shared a particularly clever insight with his teacher. And the Hazon Ish was so excited, he kissed him on the forehead and asked to quote him in his next book and jotted down an idea attributed to Tzadi Aleph for Tzvi Aryeh. My father later found the publisher expanded that to Tzair Achad, and his name had been omitted from that book too. Now, years later, after my father had become a recognized Talmud teacher in Israel and even had a radio show where he taught Tanakh and Mishnah, Pinchas Kahati contacted him and asked him to help him create a new clear commentary on the Mishnah. Kahati had a vision of making Mishnah accessible to the greater audience and needed the right scholar to help him realize that vision. Kahati credited my father in the original edition of the Mishnah, but after Kahati died, the Mishnayot Mevueret, which people call the Kahati Mishnah, was republished without my father's name. Now, curiously, my father did not spend any effort to restore his name in these cases. In fact, we didn't know he had authored significant parts of the Mishnayot Mevueret when we grew up. We found out about it from someone else who had an original edition. My father had very strong opinions about textual accuracy, but he didn't pursue his own celebrity status. And I believe this posed a conflict for him. Perhaps he thought a scholar might discover the connection through careful text study. It's worth noting that my father conveyed a different picture of the Hazon Ish to his children and to anyone else who asked than the one I heard about in yeshiva. My father told me the Hazon Ish was deeply interested in people and in knowledge, but my father's Hazon Ish was not particularly political or extreme. In fact, his description of the Hazon Ish sounded a lot more like my father himself, inquisitive, thoughtful, dignified, and torn between being in the limelight, but not really seeking celebrity. Now, in yeshiva, I heard that people would seek medical advice from the Hazon Ish, and he'd tell them which doctor to visit and which procedure to ask for. And these stories were meant to suggest that being a Torah scholar meant the Hazon Ish knew more about medicine than doctors did. So when I asked him about this, he smiled and said that his teacher met with many people, including many doctors, and asked them about their practice. He was a great listener, an important quality for a Torah scholar. And that's how he knew how to give good advice. In yeshiva, I also heard about the Hazon Ish's role in making sure that yeshiva students wouldn't be drafted to the Israeli army. And my father explained that the Hazon Ish didn't want him to join the army. And yes, he negotiated to ensure yeshiva students would not be drafted. But at the time, there weren't many yeshiva students, or many yeshivot for that matter. Given the numbers, it shouldn't have made a big difference. Now, yes, once the deal was set, yeshivot popped up all over the country. But my father was certain that the Hazon Ish didn't anticipate that. So I asked him why he went to the army if the Hazon Ish didn't want him to. And the letters we're donating show that the Hazon Ish was concerned for his student, by then about 20 or 21 years old, growing up and exploring the world outside of Bnei Brak. And my father never fully explained this, but clearly he thought he was doing the right thing. And as Professor Shapiro noted, we only have one side of this conversation. We're not sure what he told his teacher about his life journey, and I'm glad that scholars recognize this asymmetry and will attempt to complete the story with additional primary sources. Now, it's odd for me to imagine my father in the army, since he was an intellectual pacifist. He hated violence, he hated guns, he probably never threw a punch in his life. But he was not a combat soldier, he was a chaplain and an educator for the soldiers. At the time, the army was integrating Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, who came from different places, spoke with different accents, ate different foods, and had to integrate into a unified troop. My father knew that we all shared the same heritage and the same destiny. Highlighting the commonalities would bring people together. So he brought Jewish ritual and knowledge to the soldiers who had little background and provided familiarity and support to those who did. And that was very consistent with the way my father led his entire adult life. He embraced people and admired them for their unique qualities. And yes, he had strong opinions about various philosophies and lifestyles, but he didn't let those opinions get in the way of showing respect and appreciation for someone's humanity. In this way, I think he was deeply inspired by the Hazon Ish, who also invited all types of people to his home and treated all people with dignity and appreciation. So on the surface, you might not see the similarities between a Haredi Hazon Ish and a modern Talmudic scholar, Zvi Yehuda. But looking under the surface of both men reveals them. So why are we donating these letters from the Hazon Ish to my father to the Hebrew University National Library Archives? Our family discussed whether my father would have wanted to donate deeply personal and precious letters. Many of these letters have already been published in the book, Igrot Hazon Ish, so why bother with the originals? Ultimately, it was those edits that omitted my father's name that drew us to want to contribute the originals. A person's name represents their uniqueness. We're not anonymous or easily replaced with someone else. We're distinct, unique, and precious. What if the Talmud took a stance that it didn't make a difference who said what? Could you imagine reading it with the names erased? My father taught us that to study content, you have to study context. You need to know who said what. And that's why so much of the Talmud study involves attributing views to the rightful author. It's not just about them as names, it's about them as people. Charmingly, my father would speak about the people mentioned in the Talmud like they were his colleagues or friends. He explored their life circumstances to better appreciate the basis of their opinions. Their names meant they were real and three-dimensional. His life experience has taught him that a person can be excluded from his own story, accidentally or deliberately. As a scholar and a teacher, he taught the Torah of inclusion, that people must be included. And that's what we're doing here. Our father sought truth. Presenting these primary sources for scholarship is consistent with our father's most deeply held values. Scholars who appreciate primary sources will find it helpful to see the unedited original letters. And we anticipate that scholars will welcome additional facts and grapple with new provocative questions about the issues these letters raise. Our goal in gifting these letters is to make sure they're preserved, and we're relying upon the National Library Archives as the befitting custodian of these treasures to make them available to be studied. Finally, I want to acknowledge the scholars who spoke today. Professor Shapiro, my father would have greatly appreciated your thoughtful blog post about these letters. He would have thoroughly enjoyed your book, Challenging the Immutable, too. It was published shortly after he passed away. It strongly resonated with messages he would share with me about textual accuracy, scholarship, and integrity. Professor Brown, my father spent many hours with you when you were researching the materials for your scholarly biography of the Hazon Ish. You quoted him over 40 times and leveraged his insight to help inform and enhance your impressive work. Thank you for including his name and his words to honor his great teacher. All three of the Yehuda siblings are thankful to have been raised by a father who was an exceptionally great man. He was fortunate to have been mentored by an exceptionally great man too. And I'm grateful to be joined by my impressive sisters, Rachel Yehuda and Tali Yehuda Rosenbaum, and most of all by my mother, Chasia Yehuda, who was the impetus behind this donation and was steadfast in her devotion to our father and his scholarship. My father was the extroverted one, verbal and always at the center of attention, but my mother made everything happen behind the scenes, as is often the case. Their partnership modeled for us how people blend their traditional and modern values with love and mutual respect. And with that, I thank you for participating in this event.
Thank you so much, Gil. That was so beautiful. And everything you said about our father, I agree with, and I think is really true. Thank you so much for sharing. We do have some questions in the chat, and the microphones can be open, but I can also read the questions. I think that you got a very nice portrait of two men and their relationship. My father never traded on celebrity. He never bragged about who his lineage was from. There's one question here that points out he was from the family of the Netziv. Growing up, we didn't know any of this. We didn't know about the Kahati Mishnah. We didn't. It was actually my rabbi, Rabbi Weiss, who invited us for Shabbat when we moved to Riverdale and ran down to his office and brought up the original kuntras to show me. But it was not something that my father would ever brag about, because what mattered were the things that your interactions with people, not all the stuff from the past that people brought into things. But I think he would have really appreciated such a scholarly discussion. I also want to thank Professor Shapiro and Professor Brown, as well as Gil, for really making this a very scholarly historical discussion about the relationship of these two men. So let's take some questions here. One of the questions concerned just filling out a little bit more of the biography of Zvi Yehuda. And I'm just wondering, actually, if Tali, feel free if you want to answer that question, or Ima. But you'll have to unmute in order to do that. Oh, but you can't.
Okay. Thank you for turning to us here. I'm fortunate to be sitting next to my mother, who I'm sure will be happy to provide the biography of Professor Rabbi Dr. Zvi Yehuda, also known as our father. Tell about the biography and what he did.
First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here. It means a lot to me as a person, because I was 56 years going hand by hand with my husband, he was somebody that everyone looked forwards to what will become of that man, how big will he grow. He did not go for that at all. He wanted to be a teacher, to teach Torah, the way he understood it and the way he believes Chazal understood it. And it was okay with everyone in the family, because it was a very warm family man, warm and good father and husband, of course.
And I'll just add, as far as my father's professional biography, he published a weekly column on the Parshat HaShavua. He was a professor. When they first came to America, he taught at the Yeshiva Flatbush. And during the time that he was getting his PhD from the Yeshiva University, he taught most of his career at the Cleveland College of Jewish Studies. And my father and mother spent their later years in Boca Raton, where my father continued to give a daf yomi shir till very late into his life. I also want the opportunity to thank the wonderful speakers. I think listening to both Professor Shapiro and Professor Brown really gave us insights that are different than those that we have as children and as family. I also appreciated hearing more specifics about the letters and also understanding what is the legacy to us as children. Hearing about, for example, the Shmona Esrei, where the Hazon Ish taught about not moving backwards, even if it is a child. I think that would far more be stories and values that were handed down to us than, for example, if you could use insect spray on Shabbat, or whether you could close, and whether it's like an umbrella if you close a stroller cover. Those were not really such specifically taught values. Those tiny little intricacies of halacha that were definitely part of the Hazon Ish's legacy. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tali. There's a question here really about pointing out the connection between the letter of pain that the Hazon Ish wrote to my father and another similar about leaving the Haredi path, and a similar emotional letter to his former student, Chaim Grada. I just want to point out that my father didn't come to the Hazon Ish as a Haredi. He was basically tagging along with his father. So my father just stayed true to himself the entire time. And I think the relationship, if I know my father, and I think I do, I think he was just his genuine self because he didn't know how to be anything else the entire time. I think it must have been refreshing to the Hazon Ish to have someone be able to be in the weeds of the Talmud with him and talk about all of these important topics. But at the end, I think my father just stayed himself. So I don't think it's correct to see the letter as the Hazon Ish being sorry that my father left something. I think he really tried to mentor somebody to really stay, follow his footsteps. But ultimately, I think probably with a lot of thought and turmoil, my father chose to be consistent with who he was, though I think that it was very difficult. There's another comment here about that it's so important for yeshiva students and everyone else to know the realities of the Hazon Ish. And I really agree with that. I think that these letters do provide something other than the kind of discussions that are then funneled through the generations and portray people a little bit differently than who they are. I think the Hazon Ish did care, as Professor Brown, you so beautifully highlighted, that he really had a lot of sensitivity in terms of some of the way that he wanted to view things. And I do think that that's definitely something that influenced my father and may have been also part of the way my father influenced the Hazon Ish. Gil, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
You said it well. Sylvan has a question.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. It's really extraordinary. And I would like, by the way, also to just, these talks are just terrific. And I was privileged to know Rabbi Yehuda and as one of the members of our summer community, and how much we appreciated his synthesis of traditional and modern scholarship, academic scholarship, really extraordinary and unique almost, I would say. I'd just like to say that these kinds of materials of memory of the Hazon Ish, these kind of personal materials that these letters represent, and also, of course, Chaim Grada's, they represent a picture of him that fills a role that is more than one might a priori imagine. I have a friend who is an older gentleman, senior gentleman, who studied at a Haredi yeshiva in Israel long, long ago. And he told me that in his yeshiva, the Rebbeim had a problem, that they were unable to give the students a full sense of what it was like to be in the presence of the Hazon Ish and to interact with him. And they desperately tried to explain it, and they couldn't get it across. And finally, they felt they had no choice, but they went back, and in the local Israeli library, there was a copy of Chaim Grada's novel, in which, of course, the Hazon Ish under a thin veneer is presented. And they took out that copy from the library. They glued together many of the pages, which they didn't want the students to read. And then they had them read the other pages so that they would get a picture of what the Hazon Ish was like. And so that they could actually have some sense of experience and contact. And of course, students were, once the students actually saw the book and the missing pages, they weren't such chidyuks that they didn't go to the library and look up the other pages as well. But anyway, the point of my story is really that these kinds of personal elements were recognized even by the Rebbeim as being something that needed to be communicated to another generation. And Rabbi Yehuda's letters are part of that process. So we're very, very grateful for your contributing to and for this experience of today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvan. Okay, great. So I don't see any more questions, but I do see a lot of gratitude for the presentations and also for the donation of the letters to the library. And so again, I would like to thank everyone for being here. I'd like to thank the speakers who I think just did a marvelous job. And again, the National Library for putting this together. It will be available online. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure and an honor. And Shal Koach.
Thank you to all of you.
Yehi Zichro Baruch.
Amen.
Okay, now you can speak.
It's nice to see very familiar faces, which I didn't see for a long time, friends, acquaintances, family members. And thank you very much for being here, for coming and sharing with us this evening.